It is the 10th of June, 1952. Somewhere in the open Atlantic, the newest ship in America opens her engines for the first time. She is an ocean liner, built to carry passengers across that ocean in comfort, and she is about to do something no passenger ship her size has ever done. The trial board reads 38.32 knots, 44 miles an hour at sea from a liner. Below her waterline, 8 boilers drive 240,000 horsepower into 4 turning shafts, more power than most battleships then afloat. Yet the men who built her are not allowed to photograph the very things that push her through the water. Her propellers stay covered. Their design is classified by the United States government. The lines of her hull are kept out of the newspapers. Here's the paradox. This is the fastest ocean liner ever built, and her own country has made a state secret of how she does it. Her name sounds like a boast. The SS United States. She will take the transatlantic speed record, and the westbound crossing she sets will never be beaten by an ocean liner again. But the record is the least interesting thing about her. What matters is everything sealed inside her steel. One man's terror of fire. A hole dug into the ground at Newport News. More aluminum than any ship had ever worn. And a bill quietly paid, most of it, by the United States Navy. This is the story of the machines that built the SS United States, and why America would not let the world look at them. Every great ship is built against an enemy. Usually that enemy is the sea. The man who designed the SS United States feared something else. He feared fire. His name was William Francis Gibbs, and he was the mind behind the ship. The ocean, he believed, could be beaten with steel and horsepower. Fire was different. Fire got inside a vessel, took hold of everything soft and human about her, and turned it into fuel. Gibbs had seen exactly what that looked like, and he never let himself forget it. On a night in the autumn of 1934, the passenger liner Morro Castle caught fire off the New Jersey coast. She was a modern ship, fitted out the way grand ships had always been fitted out. Veneered wood on the walls, glued paneling in the staterooms, soft furnishings that made her feel like a floating hotel. When the fire took hold, all of that comfort became kindling. The flames moved through her the way they move through a dry forest, room to room, deck to deck, faster than the people aboard could run. 137 of them died. The country was horrified. Gibbs took the lesson and carved it into everything he would build afterward. His rule was simple and total. Nothing that burns goes aboard. Not wood, not fabric, not a single flammable furnishing anywhere on the ship. Where an ordinary liner used timber and cloth to make a room feel warm, the SS United States would use glass, metal, and a material called spun-glass fiber. The walls would not catch. The furniture would not catch. Even the curtains and the upholstery were made from things that would sooner melt than flame. A room on this ship was designed to sit inside a fire and refuse to feed it. No shipbuilder had ever taken it this far. Wood and fabric were not luxuries on a liner. They were how a ship was made. They lined the corridors, framed the cabins, and softened the great public rooms where passengers spent their days at sea. Gibbs looked at all of it and saw a fire waiting for a spark, so he tore the tradition out and replaced it, piece by piece, with materials that had never furnished a passenger ship on this scale before. The obsession went further than any accountant would have allowed. The story that followed Gibbs for the rest of his life was about a single piece of wood. He wanted a grand piano in one of the ship's great rooms, because a liner of this rank was expected to have one. But a piano is a large wooden box, and wood was the enemy. So before he would accept it, the manufacturer's own wood was carried out, doused in gasoline, and set alight. Only when it had been shown that the wood would not burn was the instrument allowed aboard. On the fastest ship in the world, a piano had to survive a fire before it was permitted to play a note. There was, in the end, one exception. Down in the galley, the ship's cooks needed a butcher's block, and a butcher's block has to be made of wood to do its work. That single slab of timber was the one thing that could burn that Gibbs allowed anywhere on the vessel. It became a kind of legend in the yard. One piece of wood on a ship the size of a skyscraper, and everyone knew precisely where it sat. Understand what this meant for the men actually building her. Fireproofing was not a coat of paint brushed on at the end. It reached into every choice, from the walls of the grandest lounge to the frame of the humblest chair. Every material had to be sourced, tested, and proven before it could go into place. Gibbs was not decorating a ship. He was engineering a vessel that could not be destroyed by the thing that had destroyed the Morro Castle, and he was doing it with a stubbornness that treated a single splinter as a threat to the whole enterprise. But fire was only the first of his obsessions. Keeping flammable material off the ship was a fight he waged in plain sight, in the specifications and the material orders, where anyone was free to read it. His second obsession was the opposite. It was a thing he wanted no one to see at all. Because while he was banning wood from her rooms, the SS United States was being built in a way no great liner had ever been built before. Not on an open slipway for the world to watch, but down in a walled pit at Newport News behind gates, where the water itself could be let in and shut out on command, and where the shape of her hull could be kept a secret from everyone who was not allowed to know it. The place they chose to build her was not a slipway at all. It was a hole in the ground. On the 8th of February 1950, the keel of the SS United States was laid down at the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company on the water in Virginia. For centuries, the great ships had all been born the same way. A hull was built up on an inclined ramp called a slipway, angled down toward the sea, and when she was finished enough to float, the blocks were knocked away and she slid down the way's stern first into the water. That was how the Queen Mary had gone in. It was how nearly every famous liner in history had touched water for the first time. It was tradition and it was spectacle, and crowds would gather in the thousands to watch a ship take her plunge. Gibbs did not build his ship that way. He had her assembled almost entirely inside a graving dock. A graving dock is a dry dock, a walled rectangular basin cut into the edge of the yard deep enough to hold an ocean liner and fitted with heavy gates that seal against the river. With the gates shut and the water pumped out, the basin becomes a dry stone canyon, and a ship can be built on its floor as though she were standing on dry land. No inclined ramp, no launch down the ways. When the day finally came to float her, the yard would simply open the gates, let the river flood in, and she would lift off the blocks where she stood. No major ocean liner had ever been built this way before. She was the first. The decision paid Gibbs back twice, and the two payoffs were the two halves of the man himself. The first was practical. Building on the flat floor of a dry dock let the yard work in great prefabricated sections. Rather than raising the whole hull piece by piece where it stood, they could fabricate large steel assemblies elsewhere in the yard and lower them down into the basin to be joined together. It was faster, it was more precise, and it suited a ship that had to be held to tolerances no liner had ever been held to before. The second payoff was the one Gibbs cared about more. A ship on an open slipway is a ship on display. Her hull stands out in the air for months, rising a little higher every week where anyone can walk up and measure her. A ship down inside a graving dock stands behind walls. The basin had sides. It had gates. It could be sealed off from the river and from the eyes of anyone who was not meant to be looking. The same walls that let the yard flood the dock on command also hid the shape of her lower hull from the public, from the newspapers, and from anyone across the water who might have wondered exactly what the Americans were building down at Newport News. Remember the shape of the man from the section before. He had banned wood from her rooms in plain sight, out in the open, in the specifications and the material orders where anyone was free to read them. But the shape of her hull below the waterline was the opposite kind of secret, that he wanted kept out of view entirely. In a walled basin behind gates, he got exactly that. The fastest ship the world would ever see was being assembled in the one place the world could not watch. Around that basin, the yard came alive. Newport News was one of the great shipbuilding yards in the country, and the United States was the largest thing it had ever attempted. Cranes stood over the open dock, steel arrived by the trainload, and the workforce that would put her together began to gather until more than 3,100 shipyard workers were laboring on her at the height of the build. Welders, fitters, riggers, men who would spend the better part of 2 years inside that stone rectangle, assembling the most powerful and most secret ship their country had ever ordered. They were breaking the rules of shipbuilding in more ways than the dock alone, because down on the floor of that basin, a hull was taking shape that was lighter than anything her size had any right to be. And the reason why was Gibbs's next obsession turned into metal. The trouble with speed is weight. A ship built to move faster than any liner before her has to fight the water harder than any liner before her, and every ton she carries is a ton the engines have to drag across the ocean. Gibbs wanted a vessel that could hold speeds no passenger ship had ever been designed to sustain for days on end from one side of the Atlantic to the other. To do that, she had to be two things at once that do not sit easily together. She had to be strong enough to take the punishment of the open sea and light enough to run. Strength wants steel and mass. Speed wants the opposite. The whole art of the ship rising inside that stone basin was the way Gibbs refused to choose between them. He built her hull out of steel, the way a hull has to be built. But everything above it he built out of something else. The entire superstructure, the decks stacked one upon another where the passengers would walk, the whole towering house of the ship, and the two great funnels that would become her most famous silhouette, were made of aluminum, not trimmed with it, not reinforced with it here and there, built of it. It was the largest use of aluminum on any ship to that date, and nothing before her had come close. There was a hard reason to put the light metal high and keep the heavy metal low. Weight carried up near the top of a ship is the most dangerous weight there is. It sits far above the point the vessel rolls around, and every ton of it up there makes her want to lean further and recover slower in a heavy sea. Weight carried low down near the keel does the opposite. It steadies her. So Gibbs took the mass out of the top of the ship, where he could least afford it, and he did it by trading steel for a metal that weighs a fraction as much for the strength it gives back. The house of the ship grew tall and broad above the waterline, and it stayed astonishingly light while it did. The number tells the story better than any description can. When she was finished, the SS United States displaced about 45,400 long tons light. The great Cunard Queens, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, the ships she was built to beat, came in at roughly 77,000. She was the length of an ocean giant, and she weighed as though someone had lifted a third of her clean out of the water. That missing weight was not luxury Gibbs had left out, it was speed he had built in. And the metal did a second thing, quieter than the first, that mattered just as much to the man who ordered it. Remember what he had already banned from her rooms: no wood, no fabric, nothing that would feed a fire. Where other ships lined their interiors in veneered timber and glued paneling, the kind that had turned the Morro Castle into a furnace, the United States would be finished in glass, in metal, and in spun-glass fiber, materials that could not catch and could not carry a flame. Gibbs had made those choices to keep her from burning. But every one of them was also lighter than the wood it replaced. The fireproof ship and the fast ship were, in the end, the same ship. Two obsessions that had nothing to do with each other on paper, safety and speed, met in the material and pulled in exactly the same direction. Strip out the wood and you take out the fire. Strip out the wood and you take out the weight. Gibbs got both from a single decision, over and over, all the way through her. So she rose in that dry dock lighter than anything her size had any right to be, a steel keel below, an aluminum tower above, not a stick of timber anywhere in her. But lightness on its own does not make a ship the fastest in the world. All that saved weight, every ton Gibbs had fought to keep out of her, existed to serve one thing, and it was not above the waterline. It was below it. Down at the bottom of the basin, where the hull narrowed toward the stern, sat the real reason she would outrun every ship afloat. Down there, in the deepest part of the hull, was the machinery that everything else on the ship had been built to serve. Start with the boilers. 8 of them ranged deep in the belly of the ship, each one a furnace room in its own right, turning water into steam under pressures that would tear a lesser vessel apart. Steam was the whole point. Steam driven hard enough and in enough of it to spin the shafts that ran the length of her toward the stern. 4 shafts, 4 separate lines of steel running back through the hull, each one carrying the power of 2 of those boilers out to the water. And the power they made was the number that should have told everyone what she really was. 240,000 shaft horsepower. That was the figure she was rated for, the output the engineers put on paper and promised the machinery would deliver. It is a number with no comfortable place in the passenger world because no passenger ship had any use for it. You do not need 240,000 horsepower to carry people across an ocean in comfort. You need it to carry them across faster than anything else afloat, and to keep carrying them at that speed for days on end without the machinery flagging. Then they ran her, and on trial the plant did not just meet the figure, it beat it. The machines gave up 247,785 shaft horsepower, thousands more than they had been asked to make, as though the ship had been holding something back on paper the same way she would hold her true speed back from the public. The comparison that makes the number real is a brutal one. That was more power than most of the battleships of her day carried. Warships built for nothing but war, armored, gunned, designed from the keel up to fight, and this liner had more horsepower turning her shafts than they had turning theirs. A ship full of staterooms and dining saloons, moving under more power than a fleet's worth of fighting steel. That should have been the first clue, because a passenger ship is not engineered the way this one was. Look at how the machinery was arranged and the disguise begins to slip. The boilers and the engines were not gathered together in one great hall the way an ordinary liner would have built them. all the machinery in one place where it was cheapest and simplest to run and to man. They were split, divided into separate spaces, walled off from one another, so that water breaking into one part of the ship could not reach the rest. Compartmentalization, the naval architects call it, and here it was built to the Navy's own standard. The standard you use when you expect a ship to be struck and you need her to keep moving after she is. The engines went the same way. Not one engine room, but two. Two separate engine rooms, each able to drive its own shafts, set apart from one another in the hull so that a single blow to one could not still the whole ship. A mine, a torpedo, a shell into the machinery, and an ordinary liner stops dead in the water and waits to sink. This one was built so that half of her could be flooded and killed, and the other half would go on turning her screws and carry her home. No one designs a holiday ship to survive being hit. You design a warship that way. And underneath the aluminum and the fireproof glass and the promise of the fastest crossing in history, that is what sat in the bottom of the SS United States. 8 boilers and 4 shafts and 2 engine rooms, walled off and doubled up and overbuilt, the heart of a warship beating inside the body of a liner. The government knew exactly what it had. That is why so much of what lay below her waterline was kept from view, held back, left off the record. The true speed, the real output of the plant on that trial day. And most closely guarded of all, the 4 objects bolted to the very ends of those 4 shafts, out at the stern where the steel disappeared into the water. 8 boilers were secret enough. 247,000 horsepower was secret enough. But the men with clearance did not lie awake over the boilers. The thing they worried about most was still turning slowly in the dark at the back of the dock. 4 of them. 4 propellers, one bolted to the end of each of those 4 shafts, out at the stern where the steel finally met the sea. And of everything the government kept off the record about this ship, these 4 objects were the thing it guarded most closely of all. Start with what they were made of. Each screw was cast from manganese bronze, a metal chosen to live its whole life underwater and never give up its strength. And each one, finished, weighed 60,000 pounds. 30 tons of bronze hung off the back of the ship, and then that same weight again 3 more times. Roughly 18 feet across by the figures that were reported at the time, which is to say a single one of them stood taller than a house, turning slowly in the dark water under the counter of the stern. But the metal was not the secret. Anyone who knew ships knew bronze, and knew that a screw that size would be heavy. The weight told you nothing you could not have guessed. The secret was the shape, because when you looked at the 4 of them together, something did not match. 2 of the propellers had 4 blades, the other 2 had 5. On a ship where everything came in 4s, 4 shafts, 4 screws, 2 of them wore an extra blade, and the mismatch was not a mistake. It was the answer to a problem no one else had solved. It was the exact geometry that took 247,000 horsepower and turned it into speed no other ship afloat could hold without shaking herself to pieces or drowning in the churn of her own wake. That geometry had been worked out under the roof of Gibbs and Cox, the naval architects who designed her, and the engineer who did the work on the propellers was a young woman named Elaine Kaplan. A woman shaping the screws of the fastest ship in the world, in an industry that had almost no place for her, and her calculations were among the pieces of the ship the country decided no rival was allowed to see, so they hid them. The design of the propellers was classified while the ship was still being built. When she sat in the dock and the screws were in place, they were kept covered, draped, and screened from view. The men allowed to photograph almost every other part of her were not allowed to photograph these. The line of the blades, the pitch of them, the reason 2 carried 4 and 2 carried 5, all of it was held back, the way you hold back a weapon and not a luxury. And that is the tell. You do not classify the propellers of a holiday ship. You do not drape the screws of a vessel built only to carry people across an ocean in comfort, because there is nothing on such a ship worth hiding from a foreign navy. The secrecy over these 4 castings was not vanity, and it was not showmanship. It was there for the same reason the engines were doubled and the compartments were walled off, and the true speed was struck from the record. She was never only a passenger ship, and the men who paid for her, the men who insisted the screws stay covered, were about to make plain exactly what they had bought. Here is what they had bought. The bill for the fastest ship in the world came to about $71 million, and of that $71 million, the passengers who would one day walk her decks and drink in her lounges paid almost none of it. The United States Navy did. Roughly $45 million of the cost of this liner came out of a military budget, more than half the price of the whole ship, handed over by the same government that had classified her screws and struck her true speed from the record. Governments do not spend $45 million of defense money on a holiday. They spend it on a weapon, and the weapon they were buying wore the paint of a passenger ship. Written into her design from the keel up was a second life. Given the order, the SS United States could be stripped of her staterooms and her dining saloons and converted in a matter of days into a troop ship. Not weeks, days. And in that form she could carry 14,400 soldiers packed into the same hull that had carried a few thousand tourists in comfort. She could carry them 10,000 miles without stopping once to refuel, far enough to cross any ocean on Earth and reach the far side of a war with an army still aboard and ready to fight. Everything that had looked like luxury now read as something else. The speed that outran her own escorts was not there to shave hours off a rich man's crossing. It was there so that nothing beneath the water could catch her with an army in her belly. The doubled engine rooms and the walled compartments were not there to calm nervous first-class passengers. They were there so a single torpedo could not stop her. The classified propellers were not a shipwright's pride. They were the reason she could outrun anything that hunted her. If you are the kind of person who wants to know how the thing was really built and not just the story on the postcard, take a moment now and subscribe. This is the work we do here, week after week, the machines and the truth sitting underneath them. None of this was a new idea. The Navy had learned it the hard way only a few years before in a war still fresh in every memory. Two British liners, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, the great Cunard ships, had spent the Second World War as troop ships, hauling entire divisions across the ocean at a speed no submarine could match. They were too fast to catch and too large to ignore, and they carried armies to the fight when slower ships could not. That was the lesson the United States took out of that war. A liner fast enough and large enough was worth more than a fleet of slow transports, because speed was its own kind of armor. The country had watched that lesson play out from across the ocean, and it decided it would never again go to war without a ship like that of its own. Only this time it would not borrow the idea from anyone, it would build one from nothing. Faster than the Queen's, greater in power than any liner before her, and built in peacetime quietly, while the world was allowed to believe she was only there to carry passengers. That was the bargain struck in the graving dock at Newport News. And now the disguise was finished. It was time to take her out of the dock and set her on the water where everyone could see her, and no one watching would understand what they were looking at. On the 23rd of June 1951, they let the water in. For 16 months she had stood dry in the graving dock at Newport News, walled off from the sea she was built to cross. Now the valves were opened and the dock began to flood, slowly, the water climbing the sides of a hull that had never touched it. 16 months from the day the keel was laid to the day she floated. More than 3,100 men had passed through that yard to build her, welders and platers and pipe fitters and riggers, and on that morning the work of all of them lifted off the blocks at once and settled onto the water for the first time. They christened her the United States. She rose in her own flooded dock, the largest ocean liner her country had ever built, and for the first time the public could see the whole of her floating. But floating was not finishing. For a year more she lay alongside the fitting out pier while the interiors went in, the machinery was tuned, and the last of the secrets were bolted down below the waterline. Then, in June of 1952, they took her out past the Virginia Capes for the trials, the ones the government would keep classified for decades. Out there, with warships pacing her to record the numbers, she opened her throttles and did the thing she had been built to do. She ran away from them. The reading on the trial board, the true speed of the fastest ship in the world, went straight into a sealed file, and the men who saw it were told to forget the number. A month later, they let her cross for real. In July of 1952, the SS United States left New York on her maiden voyage, bound for England, and the moment she cleared the Ambrose lightship, the clock started. Every fast liner that crossed the Atlantic was chasing the same prize, the blue riband given to the ship that made the passage quickest. The Cunard Queens had held it for years. The United States took it on her first attempt. From the Ambrose lightship to Bishop Rock off the coast of England, she made the crossing in 3 days, 10 hours and 40 minutes. About 10 hours faster than the Queen Mary had ever managed. She did not shave a few minutes off the record. She tore it open on her maiden voyage, before she had ever carried a paying passenger across that ocean. The warship, dressed as a liner, had done exactly what the Navy paid for, in full view of the world, and the world saw only a beautiful fast ship and cheered. The westbound record she set on that first crossing has never been broken by an ocean liner. In the more than 70 years since, no liner has crossed the Atlantic faster, and none has come to take the prize from her. She still holds it. The machines were real. The aluminum, the 8 boilers, the 4 shafts, the mismatched screws hidden under her stern. The 3,000 men who built her were real, and the money that paid for her, most of it the Navy's, was real. And the record they made together is still standing, held by a ship that now sits rusting, stripped and silent, tied to a pier and waiting on a country that has not yet decided what to do with her. She was the fastest ocean liner ever to cross that water. More than 70 years on, she still is.